Good evening, my colleagues. Today, we will be discussing the situation in Afghanistan. The title of the webinar is Afghanistan, a country in crisis. What is the future of this suffering country? Of course, we have very many distinguished speakers, diplomats, former ministers, media people who are following very closely the Afghanistan case, and also civil society representatives from Afghanistan and even from the United States, which is taken as one of the main responsibles of the last situations in Afghanistan. What we will discuss? We'll discuss the general situation in Afghanistan. How did we end up having the Taliban regime in Afghanistan? What were the mistakes and how do we see the future of the suffering country and its people? How international politics and superpowers are involved to this case, and how do international organizations play a significant role to save the future of the country? Before I start to submit the floor to the panelists, I would like to have the president of Eurasian Universities Union, Dr. Mustafa Aydın, to introduce a little bit about our union and what we are focusing and what we'll be discussing on the Afghanistan case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muzaffer. I want to speak my speech Turkish language, and I want to, from my colleague Irem, the translation from Turkish language to English language. Now I cannot open the camera because the place that I hear now, it is not suitable for the camera, and I want to without camera I want to speak. Thank you very much. Öncelikle ben bütün değerli arkadaşlarıma bu katılımlarından dolayı çok teşekkür ediyorum. Bulunduğum yerde kamerayı açmam halinde seste problem olacağı için müsaade ederseniz kameram kapalı olarak bu konuşmamı yapacağım.
First of all, I'd like to thank our valuable participants for being here with us today. I'm so sorry because of my internet connection. I cannot open my camera and speak at the same time, so I'll be doing my speech off camera.
Evet, önceki dönem Afganistan İletişim Bakanı, çok değerli büyükelçilerimiz, Avrasya Üniversiteler Birliği'nin değerli yönetim kurulu ve değerli üyeleri, değerli katılımcılar, hepinizi Avrasya Üniversiteler Birliği Başkanı olarak saygı ve sevgiyle sağlıkla selamlıyorum.
Former Minister of Communication of Afghanistan, our valuable ambassadors, our valuable panelists, EURAS board and members, on behalf of, as the president of the Eurasian Universities Union, EURAS, I'd like to welcome you to our conference today.
Avrasya Üniversiteler Birliği hem korona dönemi öncesi hem korona döneminde faaliyetlerine hiç aralık vermeksizin çalışmalarına devam etti.
Eurasian Universities Union continued its activities and its conferences, even although during the COVID pandemic, during and after as well.
Bu çalışmalarda sadece eğitim ve öğretimi değil, bölgesel sorunlarında siyasi, sosyal, ekonomik olarak çok detaylı olarak masaya yatırdığı çalışmalar yaptılar, webinarlar yaptılar.
During this time, we did many activities, not only in terms of education, but also regional issues in terms of economics, politics, social and cultural issues as well.
Bugün de yine çok önemli, özellikle son dönemlerde bütün dünyanın gündemini meşgul eden bir konuyu, bir devletin Afganistan'ın, kardeş ülke Afganistan'ın içinde bulunduğu sosyal, siyasi ve ekonomik şartları masaya yatıracağız.
And today we are going to discuss a very hot and in demand topic, our brother country, Afghanistan. What is the situation there in terms of economics, education, politics, social and cultural aspects?
Yeah, thank you, President. Thank you for the short introduction. And I hope, I believe that the line is off. That's why let's continue with our webinar. You know, Afghanistan since 1979 is
Tamam, şu anda geldi mi sesim?
Duyuyoruz
okay.
başkanım.
We got Professor
Tamam.
Aydın again on the
Duyuyoruz
line.
Sayın Başkanım.
Tamam. Afganistan'ın geleceğini birçok badire atlatmış ve atlatmakta olan bu ülkeyi nelerin beklediğini çok kıymetli uzmanlar, liderler ve akademisyenlerle birlikte tartışacağız.
We're going to be discussing the many obstacles that Afghanistan has faced and is going to face with the very valuable experts and panelists here at our conference today.
Hepimizin bildiği gibi Afganistan'da yaşanan gelişmeler dünya gündeminin şu anda en ön sıralarında yer almaktadır.
As we all know, the situation in Afghanistan is now a global news topic all around the world.
Birçok ülkenin askeri olarak varlık gösterdiği Afganistan'da askeri kayıpların yanı sıra sivil toplum kuruluşları üyelerinden gazetecilere kadar yüz binlerce kişi hayatını kaybetti.
Although the many military forces has lost lives at Afghanistan, also many representatives of NGOs and many news reporters and other civilians has also lost their lives during this time.
Ve nihayetinde son olarak da Taliban'ın ülkedeki yönetimi eline almasıyla beraber Afgan vatandaşların ülkeyi terk etmesiyle birlikte mülteci sorunu da ciddi şekilde patlak vermiş durumda.
And with the new Taliban government getting into the government, a new migration has been started by the Afghan people, and it's creating another problem for all of us as well.
2001-2021 Amerikan işgali sırasındaki kaos şimdi Taliban'ın iktidarı ele geçirmesiyle birlikte daha da derinleşti.
The chaos that has been going on there since 2001 to 2021 has been now replaced with the new issues starting with the Taliban forces taking into effect.
Kabil havalarında yaşanan trajik olaylar ülkede nasıl bir korku ikliminin oluştuğunu hep birlikte bütün dünyaya göstermektedir.
We all seen all around the world the situation as we have seen this what has happened at the Kabul airport not long ago.
14 değişik etnik gruptan oluşan Afganistan'dan kaosun daha da derinleşeceği çok net ve aşikar gözükmektedir.
It seems clear to all of us that with the 14 different ethnic groups right now in Afghanistan, the situation may get a lot worse in the future.
Öncelikle Türkiye olmak üzere daha doğrusu Taliban yönetimindeki belirli kişilerin değişik ülkelerde görüşmeler yapmış olmakla beraber Taliban'ın uluslararası topluma entegrasyonu şimdilik çok zor görünüyor.
Although we have seen that the Taliban government have been having some meetings and relations with many countries, including Turkey, we may say that it's going to take a little bit a longer time for them to adapt to the overall global world.
Öyle görülüyor ki iktidara gelmelerinden sonra muhtemelen çevresindeki aşırı gruplar da cesaretlenerek harekete geçeceklerdir.
And it seems that with the Taliban government in effect, the other extremist groups may also can get encouraged and cause other problems as well.
Özet olarak Afganistan ve çevresini büyük bir kargaşanın beklediği şu anda ortada.
In summary, we can say that there's a lot more going to be happening in Afghanistan in the future as we assume.
Uluslararası toplum, üniversiteler, diplomasi, toplumsal değişimde rolü olan her kişi ve kurumun bence en önemli görevlerinden biri Afganistan'daki trajedinin sona erdirilmesi, özgür ve demokratik toplumun refahı ve insan haklarına saygı temellerinde bir yapıyı bir an önce ortaya çıkarmak için işbirliği yapmalıdır.
I believe that international community, universities, diplomacy and other governments would work together on creating a free, democratic Afghanistan, which will have all the human rights in effect in the future.
Bu konferansta da bütün paydaşlara söz vererek nelerin yaşandığını ve nelerin yapılabileceğini hep birlikte masaya yatırıp çözüm ve önerileri almaya çalışacağız.
During this conference with our very valuable panelists, we're going to discuss these topics and we're going to try to find solutions to these problems.
Avrasya Üniversiteler Birliği olarak her zaman olduğu gibi bölgemizdeki sorunlara, bu sorunların eğitim camiasını ve doğru orantılı olarak gençleri ve geleceğimizi nasıl etkileyeceğini akademik ve sosyal açılardan da değerlendirip raporlayıp yayınlıyoruz.
As Eurasian Universities Union, we are discussing many different problems within our region and trying to create reports, which is very important for the future, for our young generations. And we're trying to look at it in the academic aspect, in social aspect, in many other aspects as well.
Bu misyon çerçevesinde bugünkü konferansımızın da birçok platformda kısa ve uzun vadeli değerlendirmelere ışık tutacak ve bu ışık çerçevesinde muhakkak ki Afganistan sorununa bir nebze dahi olsa çözüm olacağına yürekten inanıyorum.
And I genuinely believe that with the discussions that we're going to have here today and with the solutions that we're going to come up, it will bring light to many others who are working on this subject and will create some solution reports for everyone as well.
Bu samimi düşüncelerimle öncelikle bu konferansı düzenleyen, planlayan ve Avrasya Üniversiteler Birliği'nin kuruluşundan beri her daim desteklerini bizlerden esirgemeyen Avrasya Üniversiteler Birliği Genel Sekreterimiz Sayın Muzaffer Baca Beyefendi'ye çok teşekkür ediyorum.
With these sincere regards, first of all, I'd like to thank one of our founders and our General Secretary since the beginning of EURAS, Mr. Muzaffer Baca, for organizing and planning this event.
Tabii Afganistan'ın önceki dönem İletişim Bakanımız, değerli katılımcılar, konuşmacılarımız, akademisyen arkadaşlarımız ve tabii ki teknik çalışmasından her türlü planlamaya kadar emek veren bütün arkadaşlarımı tebrik ve teşekkür ediyorum ve bu konferansımızın başta Afganistan olmak üzere bütün insanlığa ve coğrafyamıza hayırlı ve faydalı olması dileklerimle hepinize sağlık ve başarılar diliyorum.
And also, of course, I would like to thank our former Minister of Communication, Mr. Wahidi, for being here with us today. All our other valuable panelists for their kind contributions and being here with us. I wish you all a fruitful and productive webinar. And I would like to wish you all a healthy and happy future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for your beautiful comments for our efforts and the organization. And I hope we succeed. Why we have the webinar on Afghanistan? For this time, Afghanistan is the country who is suffering the most in the world. It is a new case. It is not a new case. It's a tragedy that we are facing since 1979, after the Soviet occupation. Then we have the American occupation, and now we have the Taliban regime. Always, the part that suffered the most was the Afghanistan people. Let me to give you some small figures to understand the tragedy in a better way. For example, between 2001 and 2021, around 160,000 people died in the conflict in Afghanistan. Just 3,586 of them are Americans and other US allied soldiers. 69,000 Afghan soldiers and police died in this conflict. 51,613 civilians died, and also 5,191 opposition forces, including the Taliban, died. It looks like the most part that affected, the most part that lost its life is the civilians. Another figures from Afghanistan. You know, the most refugees who are leaving their country are the Syrians, with a number of 6.7 million. And the third one is the Afghans. Now we have 2,600,000 Afghan people left their countries, and the tendency to left more their country is very high. And every day we are getting figures, we are getting photos, films from the tragedy that Afghan refugees are facing in Turkey, in former CIC countries, in Middle East, everywhere. Just during the last months in Afghanistan, after the Taliban regime took control in Kabul, we have around 200,000 people displaced from their own villages, own cities. One of the main tragedies that we will face in Afghanistan is the situation of the women. In 2003, we had 6% of the women educated. Now we have 39% of the women educated, but because of the Taliban regime is going to restrict the women education, this will be reduced, and the women is looking that they will suffer very much more during the Taliban regime. Regarding the economic situation, I don't need to give figures now for the economic situation, because now Taliban regime doesn't have the control, doesn't have the economic capacity to keep the country economy, budget, and all of these economic activities to ongoing, including the payment of the state staff, including the payment of the people who are occupied in businesses with the state. So Afghanistan is looking like it will be leading to a chaos. I would like to get the opinion of Professor Abdulrazak Wahidi as the first speaker. Professor Abdulrazak Wahidi is the former Minister of Communication and IT in Afghanistan, and he is by first-hand eyewitness the change of the regime in Afghanistan. And he is lecturer in Afghanistan in Kabul University. Between 2011 and 2015, he was acting as Deputy Minister of Finance. That's why his comments will be very much important. And also, since 2015, he was the Minister of Communication and IT in Afghanistan. He faced directly all this development and what happened in Afghanistan. And his subject for the webinar is how Afghanistan regime ended the Taliban regime and main reasons of failure of Western support government. Dear Professor Abdulrazak Wahidi, now we are ready to hear your comments and your presentation.
Thank you, and salam and good afternoon to everyone, and greeting to all audience, and also my fellow panelists and distinguished speakers. And thank you, Secretary General of Eurasian Universities, Onion Mr. Muzaffar Baja, as I pronounce it correctly, sorry. And thank you, Professor Dr. Mustafa Aydin, for his opening speech and productive comments. I'm also honored and privileged to be invited to this important event today. And based on the subject that referred to me, it's apparently US spent 20 years and extraordinary cost of $140 billion, and they hoped to build Afghan security forces in order that Afghan National Army could deny terrorists in the future, and Afghan National Police would help the government to continue as a legitimate, capable, and stable state. But unfortunately, as we've seen that 2 months ago, everyone was shocked why Afghan people did not fight for democracy. I want to focus in this question today. Firstly, what does democracy means in this context? Democracy in general has been defined in various ways, including the famous phrases of Abraham Lincoln that said democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But in Afghanistan, democracy considered as only expensive and disposal gift from Western countries, but without fundamental needs of cultural, social, and political developments. The key challenges was the ownership, and the issue was escalated when the people role was mitigated as the second stage of the priority. The imbalance of the realities on the ground and dismal turnout had implications on parliamentary and presidential electoral process that we have seen that it had become massive exercises in fraud. The results of the election were not determined by the ballots come out from election boxes, and regrettably, controversial winner was announced through informal process by presence of ambassadors, diplomats, and special envoy in the inauguration ceremony of taking the oath of the office. That way, Afghan government was deeply mistrusted, lack of legitimacy, viewed as a puppet of US government. Therefore, the ends, ways, and means were poorly aligned. These kind of misalignments represent most common causes for failure of nation building efforts. The donor did not understand the context, and therefore failed to tailor their efforts accordingly. So that was the main reason why finally people did not fight for democracy. Because people did not understand its values. If the people do not feel they are the owner of their state, they would not care about the real risk of collapsing of the government entirely. And secondly, the corruption in Afghanistan, that was not just the problem for the system of the governance, but it was absolute system of the governance. Excessive corruption at all levels was the most insidious threat, widen the gap between the public and the government. As a whistleblower, I had talked several times with donors. Unfortunately, they treated corruption as side issue, despite its playing a central role in a collapse of the Afghan government. For example, the weak judiciary system, often bent before the will of the powerful, who can take advantage of the political connection. Other people less fortunate and unable to use such an advantage pay bribe, or they suffer from frustration due to lengthy processes. As a result, people, as much as 80% by one estimate, made use of informal justice system, and even they sometimes they turn to the Taliban for assistance. The anti-corruption agencies, we call it ACA, was disabled. Ashraf Ghani himself used, as a president, he used the ACAs as attack dog against the rivals and his political opponents in a final attempt to draft an anti-corruption law and bring the many ACAs under one roof. Ashraf Ghani disregarded inputs provided by international anti-corruption entities and civil society members. And finally, the corruption created a major crisis that weakening legitimacy of crippled Afghan governments, and that contributed to the rapid downfall of the government in Kabul. Maybe you know about my background, that I was also had some issues with the president about this. And also I was faced with the real challenges during my work with him. Equally complicit was international community due in large part of its mismanagement of assistance. A complete analysis of how financial assistance coming into Afghanistan was handled by donor raises important questions. Too much money with little or no oversight was floated into Afghanistan, which had no institutional mechanism to properly handle such resources. For example, SIGAR, maybe you know SIGAR, that is Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, in the year 2021, audited a sample of 60 US projects, and it found that 723 million, or 91% of those projects, had gone toward assets that were unused or abandoned, were not used as intended, or deteriorated, were destroyed, or some combinations of the above. Thirdly, Afghan constitution granted the president more powerful than absolute monarch. Among them is power to appoint the government officials, political professionals, from the cabinet level to district level. At the same time, the office of the president, at least in practice, tends to be filled only with one ethnic group. Afghanistan inherited this tends toward the centralization from decades of political leaders trying to personalize power and exacerbating ethnic tensions. And candidates view the presidency as the prize to be won at any cost, rather than to save the country from menace or threats. The last but not least was the problem of Mr. Ashraf Ghani behavior and personality, because I worked with him for almost 20 years or 19 years. Unfortunately, he was hot-tempered leader. He was intentionally isolated and seized by a small circle of gangs. Those corrupt people around him kept Mr. Ashraf Ghani in a bubble and disconnected him from the realities. His vision about the country was limited to that circle he got, or the briefs he got. Most of this information was fabricated by fanning the president's ego and by flattering him, since he was too narcissistic guy. The gang were accused of monopolizing power, bias, and discrimination, and by controlling everything, every authorities. For instance, in the last 7 years, he could not even to arrange his own office of administration. In his office, every week, a new structure, a new formation were created with many changes and transformations. The circle around him was regularly changing the organization and a structure and create new office for a person who was linked with one gang's members. By zoom out from his office and evaluate him as a commander of chief, in the last 2 months of his job, despite raising casualties among Afghan security forces and increased fighting with the Taliban, Ashraf Ghani had replaced the defense and interior ministers, as well as the army chief of staff. This instability of the leadership and fragile chain of commands baffled our commanders and soldiers in the battleground. That ultimately led the country to an inevitable failure. In summary, he was a deeply polarizing president who oversaw the fall of his government. He also was blamed for betraying to the people of Afghanistan, as well as other supporters like Americans by playing a deceptive game. Ashraf Ghani commanded to the army not to resist, just surrender. And the air raids and strikes stopped. Many of commanders and soldiers were executed after they arrested by Taliban. Despite Ashraf Ghani has pledged that he would not leave the country, but on August 15, the day that government collapsed, when ministers of security sectors were trying to contact him for asking instruction, at the vital moment, Ashraf Ghani was nowhere to be seen. His escape or self-exile was predictable for those who knew him from last 17 years ago. In 2004, when he was Minister of Finance, he had dealt almost same. He likely was not tolerating for peaceful transition and was not willing to transfer power or repay same respect to his successor. That's why he also deteriorated the Ministry of Finance system in 2004, including removing hard disk from the databases. But recently, although the cracks had appeared a long time ago, and it was undeniable that government could not be survived after NATO troops evacuation, but certainly no one anticipated the chaotic situation that unfolded in the country, and we saw them. He fled the country with allegation of stealing millions of dollars from Treasury. He's responsible for all these chaotic outcomes and the great exodus of the people leaving the country, as we are seeing today. Afghanistan unfortunately deteriorated from human rights perspective. In the last 2 months since Kabul fell to the Taliban, at this time we've seen a dramatic surge of violence against some ethnic groups like Hazara people. Deadly attacks targeting Hazara minorities, including attack last 2 weeks on the mosques of Kandahar and Kunduz cities, killing hundreds of people and wounded scores of others. Amnesty International recently released a report Yes, documenting that mistreatment, displacement, violence, and massacres of Hazaras are becoming commonplace. It is heart-wrenching. Yeah, it is heart-wrenching. It is heart-wrenching for me to watch my brothers and sisters being persecuted, killed, and displaced from their home and land. And despite the ongoing severe threats faced by Hazara people, the international community has been largely silent, including Islamic countries and the US government. In the final words, withdrawal from Afghanistan is better to consider in the light of the wider security concern of the world, regionally and globally. Afghanistan was the birthplace of Al-Qaeda in 1988. The group raised to terrorist network around the world, including Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which morphed into the ISIS. The US withdrawal completed, but the counterterrorism mission is unfinished. That is vital need for the world to prevent Afghanistan territory to become once again as a safe haven for the armed terrorist group. I would like to pass the floor back to my brother, Mr. Muzaffar Baja, and thank you once again. Unfortunately, your mic is off, Mr. Muzaffar. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Bahiri. What information you provided by first hand is very interesting for us, especially for President Ashraf Ghani and how he took manage the situation. Of course, such failures led to the Taliban regime. But what the social community, the social civil society in Afghanistan is facing, what the people are facing, let's hear from them also. And then Ambassador Mr. Hüseyin Avni Botsalı will give us the aspect from the international side, how they look the situation in Afghanistan. Now I would like to introduce you Mr. Shoaib Nasri. He is the head of one of the biggest NGOs in Afghanistan, based in Kabul. The name of the organization is Organization of Fast Relief and Development. They were implementing, they are implementing even now, a lot of projects, humanitarian projects funded by USAID, by BBC Trust, by DFID, Civil Development Corporation, and also Mr. Nasri is the founder of Afghan Combating Trafficking Network, which is one of the main networks that is trying to prevent the trafficking of the people from Afghanistan worldwide. He is one of the people who face directly what happened in Afghanistan, because he left this country because of fear to be attacked, to be target of Taliban. But his organization is still in Afghanistan. They are operating all over Afghanistan, and I would like to have his views and to submit his views to the panelists and the attendees. His subject is how Afghanistan ended the Taliban regime, what the civil reaction, and how do you see the future, Mr. Nasri?
Thank you, Muzaffar.
The camera, please. The camera, brother.
Do you hear me?
We hear you, but we don't see you. We need your camera on. Okay.
Okay, so you want to see my face as well?
Yeah, yes.
So thank you very much, and my greetings and salam to everyone, especially my very respected brother Muzaffar Baja and distinguished guests, and members, civil society, students. Uh, um I, as a humanitarian and human rights leader in Afghanistan, I want to speak very impartially because we, as NGOs people, we are mainly working for the well-being of people. So I will give a little information about some backgrounds of the Afghanistan recent years. Uh, I will say, as a human rights and humanitarian leader, I will say that the Bonn Agreement in 2001 was a very excellent time and opportunity for all the people and all the tribes and um, uh, parties to come up with an inclusive government. But unfortunately, I will say that the Afghan Taliban were not given the space at that time to be the part of Afghan government. So if the space were given and the opportunity was given to Afghan Taliban in 2001 in Bonn Agreement, I will say Afghanistan uh, would develop in a very better way. Uh, so by the way, I will give you some information about the recent peace agreement between the US and the Afghan Taliban. As some of you may know that the uh, Afghan Taliban and the US were able to sign a peace agreement in 2020. Uh, and as per the agreement, the US forces have to leave Afghanistan in a safe way by May 2021. Uh, and then the new government US announced that the withdrawal should be completed by end of August. And after the signing of peace deal between US and Taliban, the peace talks between Afghan government, ex-Afghan government and the Taliban started very slowly, and the developments were very unlikely. But although after a few months, around 6 months, in September 2020, the Afghan ex-government and the Taliban were able to reach in a deal that how they can target their guiding uh, to go ahead with the peace talks and peace development. Unfortunately, the Afghan ex-government and the Taliban were not able to reach a peace deal during last 1 year. Uh, I will say that a lot of internal issues were over there, like the Afghan political parties were not able to come up with a united slogan of peace and common result and common goals. And although the international community have conducted a lot of international conferences coming up together, all the Taliban leaders and Afghan ex-government, but all were in vain. Finally, the Afghan Taliban took control of Kabul on 15 August 2021. In August 2021, the Afghan Taliban were able, but a new phase started for Afghan Taliban. A lot of problems were waiting for Taliban. So, whilst a new Taliban government has now been formed, there is still tremendous uncertainty as to what the future hold for the Afghan people. The country is now in a grip of major economic crisis. International donors and international development organizations have suspended the aid for Afghanistan. The US government has frozen the more than $9 billion of Afghan reserves, and the banking system is barely functioning at this time. So the recent reports from the United Nations uh, is highlighting that current situation may lead the country to a civil war because the human rights violation, especially the human rights, women rights violation is happening at this time. Uh, at the same time, the education for Afghan people, especially young girls, is a very big problem from Taliban because report says that the most girls' schools are still closed. So girls cannot go to school. This is a very massive problem within the Afghan community at this time. Unemployment and economic problem is another problem. So the World Report, which was published by June 2021 by the US Department of State on trafficking in person, Afghanistan was unfortunately uh, uh, downgraded again to tier 3, which is a very bad condition as per the combating trafficking in person. Like as Muzaffar said before, like more than 2 million people are still in a IDP, they are in displacement, they are fleeing the country. So the victim of human trafficking are mostly the children and women. The current government, the Afghan Taliban government at this time have to uh, especially focus on countering trafficking in person, I think. Because within the scenario, I want to talk a little bit about the futures. So the new Afghan Taliban government is facing another problem, which is the recognitions of their government by the international community. Um the international community, especially UN, US, and the NATO, they are focusing a lot that how the Afghan Taliban is doing. They are looking for their actions because they want the US and Taliban deal in Doha should be implemented. As per the deal, the Afghan Taliban have to respect all the minorities and the women rights should be given to women. The education for all is one of the condition within the deal. So currently, the Afghan Taliban is facing COVID-19 pandemic as well. The international flights to Afghanistan and from Afghanistan are mostly suspended. Displacement is ongoing conflict and natural disaster is continuing to drive the humanitarian needs in Afghanistan, like more than 2 or 3 hundred thousand Afghans are displaced just in last 2 or 3 months. So we as NGOs, we are still in a good position that the Afghan Taliban have given the permission to NGOs to work for the humanitarian and development project. But as a whole, I can say that the Afghan Taliban are facing a lot of problem, as I mentioned earlier. So I hope the Afghan Taliban will respect the women rights in Afghanistan and the education for all, especially girls, is given. The employment and economic resources should be uh, created, and very most importantly, they should work on combating trafficking in person and keep very good working relationship with the neighboring countries and regional countries. Uh, So it's all from my side, and I will give the floor back to my brother Muzaffar Baja. So if you have any question, I will be very happy to answer to you.
Thank you very much, my friend Nasir, and I hope you will be in safe hands. Your country will be safe, not in the very close future, but in a very close time. I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Ambassador Hüseyin Avni Botsali is one of the most experienced and with a bright background ambassadors of Turkey. Why he is in this webinar is because he is one of the most involved the Afghanistan case diplomats in the world. Let's say he started in 1988, between 1988 to 1991. He was the first secretary of Turkish embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan. Then between 1991 to 1993, he was senior political officer at the United Nations Good Offices for Afghanistan. Afterwards, in between 1993 and 1996, he was the Deputy Secretary General of Economic Cooperation Organization, which included Afghanistan and Central Asian Republic. In the beginning, it was Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey, and later on, they included those countries also. After this first relate with the Afghanistan tasks, he was a very effective figure in UNESCO. He was ambassador in Cairo. And of course, during this career, he dealt with a lot of different regions and countries. Since 2018, he is appointed as permanent representative of Organization of Islamic Conference in Afghanistan. That's why he has the first-hand information about the meetings in Doha, the meetings in Afghanistan, the reconciliation agreements, efforts, why it is failed. I believe he will give us by first-hand the information that we need to understand why in such a rapid way Afghanistan regime failed. His speech is why peace efforts in Doha meetings failed, realities of past and current regimes in Afghanistan. The floor is yours, Ambassador Botsali.
Dear Muzaffar, thank you very much. Professor Mustafa Aydin, thank you very much for inviting me. I greet Minister Wahidi. It was good to see him after such a long time. And I thank also our previous speaker, who is an important NGO who will probably gain further prominence and precedence in the days and months ahead of us because of the very peculiar situation in Afghanistan. I am also willing to first present my excuses if I disappoint anybody, because Afghan issue does not have quick fixes or miracles or magic solutions. So what I'm going to offer, I will try not to reinvent the wheel. We are faced with a qualified audience, and we don't need to start from scratch. So I will try to shed light or bring my perspective into some of the aspects of the current crisis in Afghanistan. I will try not to exceed 15-20 minutes. This is a very limited time, but if you have questions, I will be happy to take the floor again. In a conference of a contact group of one of the broadest platforms on Afghanistan, hosted in London in December 2018, I took the floor and told over 120 prominent representatives from all over the world in Afghanistan that Britain, until it reached its current state of democracy without a written constitution, it took more than 800 years. Magna Carta Libertatum was delivered in 1215, and it took the British 800 years to build their democracy. Given today's contemporary technologies and the level of development of human knowledge, nobody would expect Afghanistan to spend another 8 centuries, but still we must also understand and demonstrate the kind of patience for the Afghan nation to build its own national experience. And it will take more than a few months and a few years. It will take several decades until a stable and resilient Afghanistan is built, and it can only be done by Afghans themselves. What the international community needs to learn is to take a step back and allow Afghans the space and the maneuvering powers to claim and genuinely gain true ownership of their own process. What I mean by ownership carries me back to the earlier phases of the 40-year Afghan conflict. Afghanistan in this recent chapter has become and still is the last fortress or the last battlefield of the Cold War. One can also say that Afghanistan is one of the last, if not the last, unsettled dimensions of the 20th century, post-Second World War, Cold War between world's big powers and alliances. If Afghanistan issue is not resolved in a viable, sustainable way, inclusive way, where all the stakeholders inside Afghanistan, in the region and beyond internationally, first of all, the region, secondly, the broader Asia, and the global environment will not find peace. So for world peace, for sustainable peace, for human development, for human dignity, the Afghan nation deserves, like any other nation of the world system of states, and the peace and the space of security and stability in order to exercise its own sovereign future or build its own sovereign future. Why Afghan issue has dragged on so long, 40 years of conflict, we ended up having Afghans killing Afghans, Muslims killing Muslims. As the last OIC representing more than nearly 2 billion population of the world, the Muslim Ummah of the world, I can say that the current state of the Afghan conflict is no longer or can no longer be defined as a jihad. You cannot define a jihad if those who kill and those who die are Muslims. If you cannot define that as a jihad, you can also not call this issue as an international dispute. Yet the stakeholders, the neighbors, the international community and the big powers, as long as they don't have a viable consensus or at least common denominator where there will be no exclusions, no isolations, no people left out inside and outside Afghanistan. If you don't have a consensus on people who say that I'm not fully satisfied, but I can live with it, again, the region, the country, the region, and Asia will not stabilize. We have to understand that. The British imperial legacy and the heritage, wherever, regardless of whether it's been in India, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, or elsewhere in other continents of the world, has a common pattern. When the imperial decolonization took place, the British left behind disputed borders and divided populations. So when you look at the case of Afghanistan in this bigger picture, you have the Durand Line designed by the British when India was gaining its independence. And on both sides of the Durand Line, which is today's current border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, you have divided tribes and you have grossly nearly 100% Pashtun population on both sides of the border who do not recognize the border. When the populations do not recognize the border becomes not only a disputed issue, but it becomes a terrain for conflict, a terrain for illegal activity, whether it's trade, smuggling, narcotics, organized crime, weapons, and human trafficking. The border, such a border, will never stabilize. This carries me back to 1988, when I was appointed to Afghanistan, and I became the last NATO diplomat remained in Kabul when, following the Soviet withdrawal, in anticipation of an inevitable collapse of the last communist government in Afghanistan, all Western countries evacuated and suspended their diplomatic representations from Kabul. Turkey decided also by then to stay on and to share the destiny of the Afghan nation and to remain in stability or in promotion of stability and solidarity with the understanding of continuity of the state. Regardless of whoever ruled Afghanistan, Turkey never interrupted its presence. And today, we are going to, or we're witnessing another replay of the same strategy, which is understandably appreciated by all segments of the Afghan society. So in 1988, the Geneva Accords, when the Afghan government was with a fait accompli from the Soviet Union, imposed upon to accept and implement the Geneva Accords, several very prominent segments of the Afghan leadership of the time had expressed their reservations, saying that it's good that Geneva Accords are going to provide an honorable withdrawal to the Soviet occupation troops. Yet, what about the remaining problems? Because Afghanistan is not the country or the people who triggered this conflict. It was essentially a rivalry, a militarized rivalry between world powers and NATO and Warsaw Pact, United States and Soviet Union, and all the regional states who lined up with one or the other alliance. So Afghan people and Afghanistan is the victim of this adventure. So what is the consequences? You have on both sides of the border in Pakistan and Iran, significant refugee populations. You have, again, an uncontrolled militarization of the conflict, accumulation of weapons, and the illicit economy of war, which included the narcotics and all kinds of organized crime activity. So they said security of the Afghan-Pakistan border is not addressed through the Geneva Accords. Again, the issue of refugees in Pakistan and refugees in Iran and in the rest of the world is not addressed. When by then Special Envoy Prince Sadruddin Al Khan tried to stage a donor conference for rebuilding Afghanistan and resettling the refugee populations, only about $4 billion were pledged, and to a great extent, those parties, donor states who committed certain amounts to that conference failed to deliver the resources which were crucial by then to stabilize Afghanistan. So 30 years after, we're about to witness an almost, I wouldn't say identical, but a replay of the scenario of state failure and international failure to build a viable consensus for an inclusive and sustainable peaceful settlement in Afghanistan. One of your questions was, what happened? Why did Doha talks fail to deliver or produce a negotiated political settlement? the answer is more than one, but I will try to summarize some of the issues. First of all, when the United States made the strategic choice of opening direct negotiations with the Taliban, which is according to the UN Security Council resolutions, at least its leadership is identified in the UN blacklist of the Sanctions Committee. Then, regardless of the fact that Americans had simultaneous declaration in Kabul of solidarity and recognition, continued recognition of the Kabul government, the Taliban side, in the first place, gained the impression that they have the ability and the legitimacy of negotiating directly with the occupying powers in the absence of the elected constitutional government of Afghanistan. So that means that the Doha agreements in February 2020 crippled the imperfect sense of legitimacy of an elected constitutional democracy in Kabul, because that government did not even have a chair in the negotiation table, and they did not sign the Doha agreement, which has been signed between a sovereign United States and an armed resistance operation considered predominantly as a terrorist organization by the world community. So that gained Taliban a certain level of legitimacy, but more than legitimacy, the confidence that if they have the strategic patience and stubborn persistence not to reconcile with Kabul, they will ultimately gain full control of the state in Afghanistan, because the state will lack one of the main pillars of international legitimacy. They will look more and more like a puppet of the occupying coalition. So this is one of the reasons. The second is, again, following the signing of the Doha Agreement in February 2020, the United States, without getting earlier consent of the Kabul government, with whom they have a bilateral security agreement, SOFA agreement between Kabul and NATO and all this, they have not agreed on a roadmap for a staged step-by-step progress of the peace process. The United States, on the contrary, committed itself to a declared deadline for total withdrawal of its military forces, and subsequently that also reflected upon NATO, and also the United States promised or committed itself to Taliban for the release of 5,000 Taliban prisoners who have been in the prisons managed, administered by the constitutional government of Afghanistan. Constitutional government and its leadership told to the United States and the world that they are not prepared to release 5,000 Talibans. According to the treaty, within 10 days, those 5,000 prisoners were to be released in return for 1,000 government prisoners in the hands of Taliban. They said, look, we're not asked whether we are ready to accept. This is our negotiation card. This is how we're going to bargain for peaceful settlement. How can you deny us the right? And we're not ready to release them within 10 days. And the president sort of tried to resist, but what happened is, within a matter of 5.5 months, exactly all 5,000 Taliban prisoners were released from regime prisons. So this also further reinforced the perception on the part of the Taliban leadership that if they can resist, and if they are determined and stubborn enough, they'll get not only a compromise deal, but they will actually break down the backbone of the Kabul government and take over Afghanistan. ultimately, we all witnessed that such a destiny has taken place. In the case of the Soviet withdrawal, if I have to make a comparison, following the departure of the last Soviet occupying troop from Afghanistan on 15 February 1989, the government of the then People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, managed to survive nearly 3.5 years. Of course, they had the logistics resupply lines with the former Soviet Union, and those lines gradually diminished following the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Yet the Afghan National Army kept defending the provincial garrisons and urban centers, urban capitals for nearly 3.5 years because they felt they were the national army of Afghanistan. When we look at the past 20 years experience, although there was a full-fledged occupation on the part of the United States and the coalition allies categorically and repeatedly announced to the rest of the world and to all the Afghans that they are not going to engage or extend the occupation to the level of state building and national building. Whereas on the ground, they were actually physically, legally, administratively building institutions subsequent or compatible with Western democratic standards. So they were saying that we're not going to do nation building, but they were doing national building. And as the Minister Wahidi rightly underlined, the level of graft and corruption was so deep into this system, not necessarily only on the part of the Afghans, but also as appeared in several of the SIGAR reports, Americans' own internal reportings. The corruption involved several major American entities, corporate bodies, etc., etc. So we have a chaotic end result where the Afghan system, the chain of command, the political leadership, was not able to exercise genuine national control of its security forces, whether it's police, interior ministry, or defense. So at the end of the day, why the state has collapsed so quickly is essentially the non-Taliban political spectrum of Afghanistan's leadership, whether the jihadi leaders of the 1980s, 90s, or the subsequent political elite and the new middle class, educated middle class that emerged or started emerging in the last 2 decades. They do not have the homogeneous, sustainable political leadership and patriotic sense of unity and integrity. So I know that time is very limited, so I have to give you an important message today. On the part of international community, the UN system has failed to deliver Afghanistan a viable platform in the 1980s to proceed to advance the peace process. And ultimately, the UN plan of peace during Najibullah time failed. And then in the latter part, during the American and NATO coalition occupation of Afghanistan, the UN, unfortunately, appeared to be an extension or a complementary subservient institution of the occupation. And the people of Afghanistan, whether they are on the political front, whether they are among the armed resistance or the ordinary people, when you talk about UN, they all respect and recognize, but they do not trust the UN. So in the coming days and months ahead of us, pending the formation and recognition of an inclusive political settlement in Afghanistan, the United Nations will have to regain and preserve its credibility as an impartial agency, first by allowing Afghans to claim and gain and preserve ownership of their own process, including the peace process. and meanwhile also to prevent state failure, state collapse, and new humanitarian disasters, starting with new civilian conflicts. If the current Taliban leadership fails to transform itself into an acceptable, inclusive political leadership, whether regardless of whether it's the minorities or the women, in the days ahead of us, the regional contenders, protagonists, or stakeholders, let's say it more flexible, stakeholders, starting with neighbors, they will start associating themselves more deeply with various segments of the Afghan society, which you rightfully also said that is divided on ethnic and sectarian grounds. So regionalism, tribalism, political sectarianism, religious sectarianism, Sunni Shia divide, Pashtun, non-Pashtun divide, will appetize the regional and international actors to associate and ally themselves with various segments or certain segments of the Afghan society. This is the nightmare scenario, because then you're going to have new proxy wars and a new Cold War in the heart of Asia. As Iqbal said, Afghanistan, Asia is a body made up of clay and water. Afghanistan is the heart of that body. If Afghanistan suffers, Asia suffers. If Afghanistan is well, it means the wellness of or prosperity of Asia. So this is the translation of a historic poem. Afghanistan is genuinely a very strategic location in Asia, and its historic problem is that it's a landlocked state. Afghanistan has been blackmailed by its neighbors since its very inception as a state, although it always had its internal problems of national unity and nation building. It always controlled an important strategic landmass, but this landmass is dependent on Karachi and now also Chabahar through Iran and India for its vital supplies, for its sustainability, for its survival. So in order to stabilize the situation, the United Nations and the regional leadership and the international community will have to work for a new consensus for economic revival and integration, starting with ending the isolationism and landlocked nature of these states. If we can open up the borders for unimpeded, uninterfered trade, as well as transport, communications, and energy sharing, if we can develop plans to integrate the regional states, the Central Asia, Iran, Pakistan, in Southeast Asia as an Afghanistan, as a new hub of this very critical strategic region, we will have the opportunity to build a political consensus of coexistence, and that will require safeguards for security that may even go to the extent that Afghanistan may seek permanent neutrality under an international treaty safeguarded by global powers. But in order to be able to start talking about these things, we will have to prevent, first, a human catastrophe. We have winter approaching, and 95% of Afghanistan population is undernourished. Even the former middle class, everybody is in need, and it's going to deteriorate very fast. The international platform, the Conference of Donors, has pledged $1.2 billion for immediate winter emergency, and the money is not coming. So we need to unblock this money and enable the United Nations and build United Nations credibility. As the Muslim world, the OIC, on the part of OIC, we also need to build a new consensus within the OIC between Iran and Saudi Arabia and other countries that for the case of Afghanistan, OIC's internal issues and disputes must be left on the sidelines, and OIC must start strategic cooperation with the United Nations system. If there's going to be a jihad in Afghanistan, it has to be a jihad against poverty, a jihad against ignorance and illiteracy, and a jihad to rebuild Afghanistan, not Afghans killing Afghans. By Taliban's undisputable military and political consolidation, although given all the constraints and the worries that I share in grosso modo, we have now the reason of conflict, the cause of conflict of one party not recognizing the other is at least it disappeared. So how are we going to bring in all these the justified, legitimate concerns of Afghan multilateralism, Afghan diversity, cultural diversity, the rights of the minorities, the rights of women? We have to engage one way. We have to find a way to engage the Taliban and to remind Taliban that they cannot just take the liberty of reintroducing all these rigid, radical, and internationally unacceptable unilateral dictums that they have once tried and ended up having or drifting into military conflict 20 years ago. It's not going to be an easy deal. I now, as an individual, I will remain committed and engaged in Afghanistan. We're the only international corporate body now. I work for an international contractor who are continuing projects in Afghanistan. We need to find a way, create the space to engage the international community. And of course, Taliban will have to understand that they will have limits, because if they insist on what they are currently doing, although this immediate civilian casualties has diminished significantly because the conflict ended, but there are potential new conflicts that may surface up unless Taliban moves into a more flexible, more acceptable, more internationally workable parameters. We need to encourage them rather than directly confront or radicalize them, because they are already radicals and they have gained, with their current stand, in their own perception, a victory. We need to understand that this victory is not going to lead them into stability unless they demonstrate flexibility. So this is the end of my current presentation. I'm ready to answer any questions. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
It was a very, very informative presentation. Of course, I do agree with the role of the United Nations, because not only in Afghanistan, in Syria also they are failing. All over the world they are failing with these passive policies. On the other hand, as I understand from the Afghanistan politics, United States, Russia, China are using Afghanistan as a terrain for their own conflicts. Of course, I don't want to blame those big powers. The first responsible for the situation in Afghanistan is the Afghan people. Key player in Afghanistan politics, in Afghanistan history during the last 20 years is the United States. We have now the floor. This is Nahid Popal, who is from Afghan origin, lives in the United States, and also she was leading the program about, she was program officer of Afghan Development Association in the United States between 2011 and 13. Late after, she took as a director of the Women Leadership Program of Afghan Women's Educational Center in the United States. Now she continues her task with the Afghan refugees as advocacy coordinator of Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, and also she is program officer in International Republican Institute. Everyone blames United States for the failure of the Afghanistan politics and what is happening now with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. As Professor Wahid, the former Minister of Communication and IT, as Mr. Shoaib Nasri, one of the leading NGOs leader of one of the leading NGOs in Afghanistan, Ambassador Botsali, who was firsthand facing the problems and trying to reconcile both sides for a better Afghanistan. All of them, somehow they blame the United States. What the United States community is looking for the policies of the United States governments. The role of the US in Afghan politics and the reaction of civil community is your subject today, Mrs. Naid Popal.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be with such a distinguished panel. To start off, I want to give a brief background about how the US got involved in Afghanistan in the first place. So back in 2001, as we know, after the terrorist attacks, the US intervened in Afghanistan. And over the last 19 years, the US has suffered 22,000 military casualties, including 2,400 fatalities. Since that time, Congress has appropriated approximately $144 billion for the reconstruction and security forces in Afghanistan. So 61% of that amount was for security, 25% for governance and development, and another 14% for civilian operations and humanitarian aid. And then if we also look at the Department of Defense's cost of war, there was roughly $824 billion spent on combating the war in Afghanistan. So right now, you know, the last 5 years, the main issue in Congress was the fact that half of Congress wanted to end, you know, one of the forever wars in Afghanistan, meaning that, you know, there had been over 15 years you know, dedicated to fighting terrorism in Afghanistan. So over the last 5 years, they were focused on ending this war. But then the other half of Congress wanted to preserve the gains made for women and children in the country. And so as the ambassador spoke about prior to me, the peace deal back in February 2020 undermined the legitimacy of the US of the Afghan government by legitimizing the Taliban as an entity of its own. And when Biden continued to honor that peace deal and started to withdraw troops from the country, we saw a rise of violence from the Taliban, who were emboldened by this act. And then finally, the country collapsed in August of this year. So moving ahead, what's happening now? Right now, we are experiencing upcoming talks by neighboring countries. So just yesterday, Russia had a conference on the future of Afghanistan. And although the US was invited, they did not attend, although they stated that in future talks they would come. And during this conference, Afghanistan's neighbors, such as Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, they all were calling for the UN to convene a conference to stop the economic collapse and to provide humanitarian relief because of the crisis coming up in the winter months. They've also asked the Taliban to have an inclusive government that would include all ethnic groups and political forces. And then if that was to happen, and they were open to recognizing the Taliban as the leaders of Afghanistan. So the neighboring countries are really focusing on this specifically because of the security threats and the rise of ISK, which is the Islamic State of Khorasan, and as well as Al-Qaeda. And so all of the countries have pledged humanitarian aid. So we'll see upcoming talks coming up in Iran in a matter of days, as well as India, who has announced their own separate talks sometime in November, still to be determined. But as you can see, the US is having no role whatsoever in these upcoming talks, simply because they have stated they are not interested in nation building whatsoever. So what are the US's current priorities in Afghanistan? The first thing we are looking at is counterterrorism. Number two is evacuation of Afghan allies and American citizens stuck in Afghanistan. Three is helping with the refugee resettlements. And then fourth is humanitarian assistance. But like I said, the US has made it very clear they have no desire to nation build or put pressure on the Taliban. This was something that was focused on for the last 20 years, and they believe they've failed. So I will kind of cover each of those 4 points. So for counterterrorism, like I stated, there's a rise of violence from ISK. Just in the last 2 weeks, we've seen 2 major attacks on Friday prayers in Kunduz and Kandahar, where the Shia minority have been targeted, and we've seen the death of over 100 or so Shia Afghans. And you know, ISK is also an enemy of the Taliban, and they're using the same tactics that the Taliban were using during, you know, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. So it's the irony of war, right? So they're using basically the same suicide bombing and IED threats as the Taliban did back in the day. And then what the U.S. is worried about is another safe haven for Al-Qaeda, similar to the 1990s. So back in 1999, former President Bill Clinton had put sanctions on the Taliban. These sanctions are still in place. And Biden has committed to holding those sanctions in place until there is an inclusive government, which includes women and minorities. So once again, like the ambassador said, there is a pause on the reserves and a pause on the funds in country, which is going to create an economic and humanitarian crisis in the upcoming months. So the next focus point for the US is evacuations. There are roughly 1,000 citizens still in the country. And then we have SIV and P1 visas still stuck in the country. And then we have tens of thousands of Afghans who had risked their lives by either working with the military or by working with US government through contracts or through nonprofits that are still stuck in the country and are targeted daily. We've been seeing the Taliban hang these individuals, such as journalists and civil society activists. So the threat against them is very real. And right now, the US is supporting evacuation efforts. We have roughly 4,000 Afghans in Albania. They are hosted in resorts and they're staying there, and their costs are covered. We have Afghans in Qatar, in Dubai, in Pakistan, many other countries as well. So they are ongoing, and right now we're looking at land routes because the Pakistan Airlines has stopped flights. So we're looking at land route options either through Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and seeing a viable, safe way for us to continue evacuations. Next up is the resettlement of Afghans. So right now we have 3 of the main visas, which is the SIV, the P1, and the P2. So SIV is for those individuals who have worked with the US military or contractors in Afghanistan or Iraq. And then P1 are for individuals who are well-known and have need to be referred by an organization that has connections with the US government. And then P2 was a newer visa that was created simply to broaden the reach of how many Afghans could apply for refugee status. However, to qualify for P2, you have to leave the country for about a year, and then you can apply for resettlement in the US. So next slide, please. If we look at resettlement in the US, we currently have roughly 55,000 or so Afghans in bases. So there's 9 bases, and these Afghans that have been evacuated have been staying in camps. The situation is very dire. The government is not providing direct support. So it's mostly been the Afghan community and the diaspora that's been mobilizing and helping these individuals inside the camps by providing them with winter clothing, basic necessities. So these individuals have to stay in the camps until they're processed and they pass security checks, and then they will be resettled into the US. So that time frame is unknown, but this number is rising daily, and a lot of the camps are reaching capacity. And then the next area of focus for the US is humanitarian aid. The US is planning to provide humanitarian aid to independent groups such as the UN, other nonprofits that are working in the country, but they do not want to give aid directly to the Taliban. And this was something that Secretary of State Blinken had explained in August. And then also we've had European Union and besides Russia and China and India pledge around 1.15 billion in humanitarian aid. And then where we've been seeing gaps, the diaspora has really been mobilizing and supporting the community. So what is the civil society reaction? Right now, what is happening in Afghanistan is a humanitarian crisis. However, civil society and the humanitarian aid sector is unable to safely gain access to the country because of the current situation. And many of these organizations that used to operate in Afghanistan have ceased operations. Civil society priorities include urging parties involved in Afghanistan conflict to cease fighting and to have a negotiation point, which once again is focused and centered around preserving the gains made in the last 20 years. Like one of the speakers prior to me spoke about was, just female education went up from 6% to, 34%, I believe it was. And so we want to build on those gains and make sure that they're not compromised. And then also providing humanitarian relief, especially as winter approaches. And one of the ways that the US and the international community plans on having an inclusive government is by putting pressure on the Taliban by stating that, if they want humanitarian aid in return, they have to include women and youth and ethnic minorities in their government. So they're using the aid as a leverage. So hopefully this will be enough for the negotiations moving forward. But as of now, the US does not plan to have any conferences or to take part in any of the regional conferences that are happening, and are solely focused on the refugees that they need to evacuate and the refugees that are in the US currently. Thank you. And any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Mrs. Nakit. It was very informative about the situation. Informative speech about the situation of the Afghans looking from the United States aspect, And of course, I totally agree with just one point that Ambassador Botsali also referred. There is a lot of money for Afghanistan. As you gave the figures, 44 billion US dollars for Afghanistan is very big money. But what happened to this money is a question mark. Most of it is disappeared because of the fraud, because of the regime, and also because of the American contractors. So the people of the ordinary people are going to the pockets of those who are bribing, and you see the results in Afghanistan. This is the outcome of the Afghanistan situation. Now we have, thank you very much for the presentation. Now we have Recep Levent Öztürk. He is right now in Kabul, and he is eyewitnessing by himself the situation in Afghanistan, interviewing the people in the streets, and he's trying to understand how do they feel for their future. Levent Öztürk is correspondent of Turkish radio and television in Afghanistan before he was dealing in Pakistan, and also he's representing my organization, International Blue Crescent. He's organizing our emergency and continuous relief operations that my organization is funding. Yes, Levent, now we are ready to listen from you the last situation, the current situation in Kabul.
Well, I think I'm the one person can say what's happening on the street and what the people say on the street, what they're thinking about the current situation, because, well, as you also, everybody, first I have to thank you, give me the chance to share my points and views with you, because there's very important person meet together on these meetings, and they have shared there also, especially the ambassador. He knows me. I think he remembers me when he was also in Kabul. We met many times. I made interview with him also too about the situation. He was that time also point everything what will be happening next in Afghanistan, which is now he is also the leading for the change, strives best to do something to future of Afghanistan. Well, first, unfortunately, the situation is not well, as everybody knows. Not only we face recent years the humanitarian problems like IDP crisis or refugees. Most important thing now, the economic crisis, which is after the Taliban came power in 2 months back, all the government institutions or trade organizations, whatever you are saying, that the main blood of the country is to live for the future, it's almost cut off. I can say, I am sorry for my English is like not perfect to be explained, but think about one patient, he has a corona, and now he is on the very important position. He's now in intensive care, and he needs oxygen because he needs that to be lived. But Afghanistan now don't have enough oxygen to continue their people's life. I'm not talking about the what can I say, general humanitarian crisis now. The thing is, even the middle class, or even because the old rich is left already from the country, they are suffering because there is no income, and also the trade is stopped. Borders are closed. There is no chance to come any kind of goods or money to be continues their life. So the point is now Taliban trying to be settle the situation as a good, but they not capable to do that because there is not enough educated people or enough people to do work in health sector, education, or the border control, which means all the system is stuck now, and now the country is suffering badly. International community looks try to do something about it, but the winter is coming, and the reality on the ground is more bad than the people imagine. You have to see on the street the people faces. They don't know what's going on next. But Afghan people are strong. I mean, they are suffered a lot last 5 decades. They are in the war, civil war, invasions, many terror attacks. But now they don't have even take the bread in their homes. Most of the people, most of the families, and this is right now in this stage. What about next couple of months? If there's nothing changed, going better, it will be catastrophic. So now everybody talks about Afghanistan, news coming air about explanation about the situation of Afghanistan, what's going to be, what's going in the future. We have to talk about what can we do for the people on the IDPs, or who's now asking support from their income from their families. So girls, they don't have any chance to educate right now. There are big mark questions, and there is no answer right now. Everybody is asking somebody to give them answer, but unfortunately, there is no answer right now. Most important thing, the international flights must be resumed because otherwise the borders are very catastrophic. I was eyewitness as a 6 or 7 kilometers away. Trucks are stopped on the border side. The goods on the trucks, but they're not coming in or can go out for the trade, which means it's also another big problem. What can I say? When I talk to people on the street, if I ask them what you think about the Taliban, most of the people avoid to speak with me because they're scared, feel scared. Taliban facing on the street positive. Mostly they are smiling. They're trying to be kind to the people. From my point of view, they are trying to be say we are calm to power to help the Afghan people. Don't afraid us, we will be support you for every angle. But unfortunately, their way to do that sometimes is not working. And they can't control all the Taliban groups, and most of them very unkind. So this is also another problem on the future we can face, and we can see maybe some bad stories about the reaction of the people or the Taliban story, how they treat somebody badly. I don't want to be make too much comment on the treat, but one thing I have to say, people are worried for their future more than before. Nobody did everything for Afghanistan, and I hope this time people of the world and the international community more honest than before. They have to be honest. I don't think they didn't vote honest on the street. Well, if I continue, it will be more bad news for you guys. I mean, I'm sorry for that as a journalist, as also a humanitarian worker. I'm really upset because I spent 20 years in Afghanistan. When I first came to Afghanistan, the Taliban power was out, and the Americans came in the October, in the end of the 2001. Now, 20 years back, and if I see the street, like everybody mentioned, billions of dollars came from this country, but these holes still remains in there. So where did go this all of money? It's true, and it's the reality, it not came from the Afghan people to be build their own country. Nobody helped for them, which means we have to be honest ourselves. International community, we are talking too much, but we are not doing anything on the ground. So this time, it's the real action will be start. Otherwise, we are facing very, very big problem, which is then we are all regret what we didn't do, why we didn't do anything for this. I'm saying this time, clock is ticking very, very dangerous position. If we are not, if the international community not acting very wisely and honestly, do something about Afghanistan, then the bomb is explode very big way and affected all of the country. This is I can say right now for the year. If any questions, it will be good for me. I'm very happy to answer the questions what's happening on the ground now in Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Levent. Thank you. Now, what is the outcome of this webinar? What I took some notes. First of all, for the situation in Afghanistan, first responsible people are the Afghan people, because they are not united as an Afghan nation. There is no Afghan patriotism to defend the rights of the Afghan people, and also the tribal conflict and conflict of interest between the Afghan people is one of the main reasons that international powers are using Afghanistan as a terrain of their own conflicts. We had this Russian occupation between 79 to 89. Then we have this American occupation between 2001 to 2021. The American occupation was targeting to eliminate Al-Qaeda. Now, what you see in Afghanistan now, Al-Qaeda attacks Taliban, something like that, you know. United Nations is not in Afghanistan, is not in Syria, is not anywhere in the world. They lost their power. They are not settling the disputes. Before, you remember during the Bosnia War, during the Kosovo War also, we have seen how the United Nations, because of its organizational structure, couldn't manage to stop those wars. The same happens in Afghanistan. Do you imagine a conflict about almost 35 years, 30 to 35 years, and nothing is done for those people? Before I close the conference, the webinar conference, I would like to give the floor to each speaker just to have few comments on the situation, and then we will close the webinar at 5 o'clock. First speech I would like to have from Mr. Professor Abdulrazak Bahidi, what he listened and what his final comments.
Thank you very much. I have learned a lot from this panel, and thank you every speakers for their productive comments and productive speeches. I don't have any more comments to add to my former speech, but if there is any question, refer to me. I would like to answer.
Thank you. What about you, Brother Shoaib Nasir?
Thank Muzaffar, brother. It's my pleasure to be part of this very important conference. I will, by the end of my speaking, I will only say that the Afghan current government should focus on the girls' education and provide freedom of speech and rights for the women and human rights. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nasir. And Ambassador Botsari?
Thank you. I would put a number of points. One is strategic patience. Second, the international community will have to create and promote sufficient space for the Afghan people to gain the ownership of their own destiny and the ownership of any process for sustainable peace, to prevent total depopulation of the educated middle class and upper middle class of Afghans, to prevent the fleeing of qualified Afghans who will be the builders of their own country's future, to encourage Taliban to prevent radicalization and totalitarianism, and to open and sustain dialogue and demonstrate flexibility towards transformation of the current interim, whatever setup, into a genuine representative and inclusive Afghan government, to promote without encouraging further sectarianism and disintegration and separatism, to encourage cultural diversity and inter-Afghan dialogue, obviously to promote women's and children's rights, girls' rights, starting with education and their participation into all segments of the society, including the future administration of the country, to encourage the international community and donor nations to mobilize their pledged and unpledged funds for future Afghanistan, starting with immediate winter emergency, to provide sufficient inflow of food, medicine, and other emergency items so that the current plight of the Afghan nation does not deteriorate, to prevent the formation of new proxy wars, and to prevent dialogue among immediate neighbors, peripheral states, and the bigger nations, to build, and no matter how imperfect, a broad international consensus on stabilizing Afghanistan and preventing outbreak of new domestic civil hostilities, as well as a new Cold War across the borders in Central Asia, Afghanistan, and Eurasia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Botsari. Thank you very much. And what about your comments, Nahid? Nahid, do you hear me? Anyway, thank you very much for.
I do.
Thank you very much. Yeah, hi, Nahid. Okay, what about you? About your final comments?
Hi, sorry, I was on mute. I think just one final comment.
Your voice is not clear, Nahid.
Again, I think a lot of the countries have actually looked at different accountable. Can you hear me now?
Right now, I hear you, yes.
Okay. Just stating that the US and other countries should be held accountable for the future of Afghanistan. And so we should continue mobilizing and looking for support in that sense.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. What about you, Levent? Your last comments?
Well, I hope Afghan people can deal their future together and find the peace because, of course, the future of Afghanistan is their own hand. But now they're too much concerned about their future, and especially for the economic crisis in their hands. One thing I have to tell, if they can provide their own life back and they come back their own feet, Afghanistan will be very strong and good country to provide peace for the whole region. This is all the Afghan hands now.
Inshallah, Levent. Thank you very much for the great contributions you done to this webinar. And let me to say that we recorded this webinar and we sent to all participants and attendees, and even it will be published in the YouTube channel of EURAS. Thank you very much once again, and goodbye to all of you. I wish you a great day and great future. Thank you.